Great. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming to my session, especially here. I know at this point, reInvent's probably taken a bunch of your energy, and so it's good to see you all here in the morning here, and really looking forward to delivering this talk today. As the slide says, my name's Todd Golding. I'm a solutions architect at AWS, and I've been in this role for 11-ish years here at AWS, cloud application architect, cloud infrastructure, working with organizations who are all kinds of stages of building and delivering SaaS solutions. I say SaaS solutions because so many of my talks are about SaaS, but in really any kind of application on top of AWS. I had the good fortune of having started in this space a very long time to be at the beginning of the emergence of a lot of interesting new application architecture strategies. And at the beginning of all this, it had already sort of gotten a little bit of momentum, but I kind of got to be at the very beginning of seeing microservices show up in a big way in the scene before they were wildly adopted. I remember giving talks about microservices where people were just hearing about microservices for the very first time. But now we've seen that microservices are a really good fit for just general application architecture, but also a really good fit for sort of the value proposition of the cloud, right? When we look at scale and resilience and sort of optimizing consumption and all the things we try to do with applications, it turns out microservices are an awesome fit for that experience. And I work with organizations all over today that are still very much leaning into microservices as their predominant way of building their solutions. But I also think we've been in this space of microservices a little while now. And we've seen lots of people sort of pick up and adopt this strategy. And one of the concerns I've seen, and it's not universal, this may not apply to all of you, but what I've seen is people sort of picking up the methodology of microservices, picking up the value proposition of microservices, and sort of lifting the cookie cutter model of here's how I see everybody else doing it, here's the examples of what a good microservices architecture looks like, and they sort of just wholesale bring that into their organization and just start going crazy with where are microservices, what are we doing, like how can we replicate all the goodness that I see in all these other implementations. And the challenge I see with that is I think the intent of microservices and the value prop of microservices are absolutely all valid and good, but what's been missing is context to me. Because to me, that something can be valuable as a set of principles, but we still have to map those principles to the reality of our own organizations. What types of teams do we have? What's the skill sets of our teams? What business problems are we solving? What's the operational profile of our organization? What's the nature of our workloads? And I feel like somewhere along the way that added context of what we're doing and why we're doing and what flavor of microservices that fits for my organization has gotten lost a little bit along the way. Instead, it's like we have this methodology, we're gonna go use this methodology, we've identified our microservices and let's go. And when I walk in, I find these organizations who've like built these massively heavy microservice-based solutions and they're unwinding them because they've added too much complexity for their organization or they're not seeing the value or the trade-off of what they did versus the value they're seeing isn't quite well aligned to this. And it's not because microservices were a bad idea, it's that when they set out to build and decide which microservices were in their system and where they would get the real value of microservices in their environment, they didn't consider all this contextual information. Instead, they just went after kind of the nouns that were in front of them, made services and went, right? So for me, and I'm not new to this topic, I really feel like it's important that we start asking ourselves more and more, like, what are the right size services for our particular environment? Like, what is the granularity that's appropriate for our environment? We're still gonna push for all the same goodness that we'd push for in any microservice environment, but we're gonna be less judgmental about what's a good microservice-based architecture and ask organizations to push themselves to figure out what flavor of microservices are right for their business. So that is gonna be the point of this talk today, right? We're a 300 level talk. We're not gonna crack open the IDE and write a bunch of code or do anything like that. I really want today to just talk about the mental model for how you might think more. What data, what parameters should you be thinking about when you're deciding how to decompose your system into microservices, and maybe even look at what the life cycle of how those services come to life, and even how you might add more views into your system to evaluate, do you have the right microservices? How can we shift and evolve our architecture in real time to figure out how and where we are drawing the boundaries for our architecture. So I hope that fits with why you're here, and hope that sort of aligns with what you're hoping to get out of this. And with that, I'll kind of push forward. And I feel like, as a disclaimer here, I want to be clear that the overall principles of microservices are sound, they're valid, they are good, they represent a good sort of approach to decomposing and building a system. We still want to achieve and realize the values of agility and innovation and smaller blast radius and loose coupling, and we want to be able to have teams who are autonomous, who can work on these and encapsulate storage and work based on contracts more, like all those principles that are probably being talked about here and has papers and has all kinds of other presentations about them. Those principles are solid foundational principles, and we still want to achieve those same outcomes. I just don't think that achieving those outcomes presupposes a size for the services that are in your environment. I think you can have different sizes for the microservices in your space and factor in your reality. These, like agility even, and efficiency and blast radius means something different to different architectures, and where it's concentrated and where we want to focus is different for different organizations. So we don't want to just say to grab these things wholesale and take whatever the blueprint of what everybody's doing and just replicate that. We want to add context, and you're going to get tired of hearing that word context from me here, but that is the overarching desire. Now, I think part of the challenge of how we got here is a little bit of sort of shiny object syndrome. I'm an engineer, I like shiny objects. I know that when I see cool new toys and cool new techniques, I want to lean really hard into them because honestly, it's fun, to be fair. And when we look at some of the early sort of examples of microservices we had these really cool examples where companies would show us these massive webs of microservices they had in their environment, and all these cool things they were doing, and all these cool tools they were building around them to make them deployable and to implement circuit breakers and to do fallback patterns. Netflix was doing all kinds of cool and interesting things and continues to do cool and interesting things in this space. But these people are also building for massively scalable systems that have very complicated resilience profiles. But these were the examples we had. So when organizations sat down and said, well then, what should my microservice architecture look like? I think what they're doing is pretty cool. That looks really awesome. The story turned into one where people viewed the number of microservices they had as some kind of indicator of the quality and the value of the solution they were getting. So people would have real pride to walk into a room and say, you know, they would say we have microservices, but they wouldn't just say we have microservices. They'd say we have 500 microservices. And it was the fact that there were 500 that made them think we're doing these really awesome and cool things. And then the open question I'd always have with this is, do you really need 500 microservices in your organization? Like, how did you get there? And I think it was the appeal of and the view of the universe where everybody was like, the more small and tiny these services were, the more of them we could throw up onto a big diagram and show everybody we had a ton of microservices, the more comfort we had that we were living up to the value proposition of microservices. And again, that company that has 500 microservices, that might have been the right answer for them. I just get nervous when the quantity of microservices ends up being like a driving factor and almost a metric that makes us feel like we've done something good or something valuable. I'd like to move away from that, and I'd rather take more pride in, am I getting the value out of the microservices, however many there are? And is my organization and the operations of my organization and the overall profile of how we build and deploy and create these services getting the broader value that was what drove us to microservices in the first place? Now, part of this is, I think, the sizing bias and where a lot of us started. And again, I might be dating myself a little here. But so many of us started in this universe where we had some kind of coarse-grained notion of architecture. A lot of us worked in these spaces where we had N-tier architectures, and we had, in this particular case, web app and storage tiers, and we'd put all of our services into this app tier, and we'd have some notion of services in there, but their coupling was probably a little tighter, and the unit of deployment here usually was the whole app tier, right? We're gonna fix something in one service, we fix it in one service, we deploy that whole app tier, and that's our unit of deployment. And of course, that's the reason why so much was trouble here, because testing it more, the blast radius of deploying it, the frequency of deploying it. It was heavy. But also came with this was the idea that if something's bigger, if it's more coarse-grained, it's bad. And that because the roots of kind of the monolith gave us this sense that anything that's coarse-grained is bad. And then when microservices came along, the notion was, well, if it's fine-grained, it's good. Like the notion of microservices also had this attachment of size with it that said the smaller it is, the smaller my services are. I'm gonna make them as small as I possibly can. In fact, I used to always have people come up to me after talks and stuff and say, what's the right size? Like how small should we go? And they would be talking about these, we're gonna make this service that almost does nothing, but because it's really tiny and small, it's awesome. And it lets me have more of them, by the way, back to the count kind of thing. Obviously, they're doing a good job in making sure they're not chatty and so on. But for me, I'd like to move away from this idea that coarse-grained is somehow bad. Like coarse-grained, something can be bigger and still realize some of the value in a microservice space here. Now, if we look at how we arrive at the microservices in our environment, we'll see that there's methodologies out there that have come to life. I mean, domain-driven design was around, but then domain-driven design got applied to this space very heavily as a way to identify this. And we have these methodologies that helped organizations go away and say, help us find our microservices. What are the techniques that we can use to go use them? And absolutely, domain-driven design is a good way to like tease out where these bounded contexts and where these other sort of opportunities for microservices are in your environment. And we've also seen people get into event storming as a way of looking at microservices, and we look at another view of this. Some people do both of these together. There's all kinds of flavors of this. These are absolutely valid ways to try to arrive at your microservices. But the problem is that they mostly look at it from the view of your domain only. Like, what are the domain objects? What are the nouns? I remember, again, dating myself, when I first started learning object-oriented programming, they taught us this technique of like write down a sentence about your system and then go underline the nouns. And are those nouns really good candidates to be objects in your system, right? And so the nouns became like, oh, we've got a product, we clearly have catalog, we have all these things. And I think we ended up like, well, those must be the microservices in my environment, and whatever the microservices that come out of that are, those are the ones we're gonna go. And yes, we're gonna think about scale and we're gonna think about efficiency. It's not like we're gonna do this blindly, but in general, this process is missing the thing I'm most talking about, which is context, right? It has the context of your domain, but it doesn't have the context of your business, of your team, and all the other things we wanna think about. So for me, I wanna say, yes, do these things, but I want to overlay on that an additional layer of thinking that helps us figure out which services are the right service for our environment, right? So for me, essentially what I want to do is I don't want to size blindly. I want to size with data and with value in mind when I'm thinking about what my objects are, now I'm dropping into OO again, what the services are in my system, right? And so I want to challenge and get in a mindset where I challenge the set of microservices that we've come up with and ask myself, where am I, as I decompose these things and I make them small, are they going to return the right kind of value based on that size? And what data do I have to tell me whether or not being isolated, and we'll get into examples of this, what kind of data you might look for, what data will tell me whether these are good microservices or not good microservices? And to me, it's like avoiding falling into the noun trap. Because I worked with one organization, we went in, they were modernizing their solution. We were talking about where could be some good candidate microservices for their system. And then I left and I came back like 2 months later and they showed up with this spreadsheet of like 200 microservices because they just like, look at all the places we could introduce microservices. And I was like, do you really, is there value for those? What data tells you you need to go create all 200 of these microservices? And again, the answer might be they have a really good reason for those 200, but a lot of times there isn't a good reason. It's just, it seemed like a good thing to draw a box around, and it would be separate deployment, so we'll get better resilience. Yes, but are you going to get value out of that as well? And we have to start asking those value-related questions. So for me, part of this, and this is me being a little pedantic here, is about shifting our terminology. The notion of microservices was a really good way to label this when it first came out, right? Because Micro did say we did want things to be smaller. That was absolutely the goal. And Micro did give us this sense that, yes, we're going to create smaller services, and there should be an emphasis on smaller services. But then now, all these years later, after we've been doing this, Micro now all brings this baggage that Micro also implies that the size must be small, right? And to me, I would prefer to move away from microservices and just refer to these as services in my system, some of which are small and some of which are not so small. And if you end up on the left-hand side and you all look like that, that's fine. But did you go there because you felt like you had to live up to the sort of Micro mindset here? It's funny, I was writing a book this last year, and I had this whole chapter that referred to all these microservices all through the chapter. And the tech reviewers gave me their feedback, and they said, why are you calling them microservices all through the chapter? And it's just become my default language that when I talk about a service, I call it a microservice. The truth was the services weren't necessarily small or anything else, and they're like, well, then why not just call them services? So sure enough, I not rewrote, but at least edited the entire chapter and switched all my terminology to services because that felt more inclusive and promoted this mindset of Micro doesn't have to be small. And I'm not at all advocating that the industry should stop referring to this as microservices. I'm fine with calling it microservices, but in the back room when you're doing this work, don't bring the Micro in a way that it means it has to be small. On the soapbox there a little bit, had to go there, sorry. So let's think a little bit beyond domains, because I feel like domains are a good way to get here, but what else might we need to be thinking about in terms of sizing these environments? What other factors should we consider, right? And so to me, and these aren't all of them, but if I were to say, like, what are the things, or some of the top things I would think about when I think about how I size an environment, I'm absolutely going to ask all the good questions. Don't think I'm leaving out the bounded context and what the interactions are and how loosely coupled. I'm still thinking about all those things. But I'm also thinking about, like, operational complexity. Like, the more I decompose a system, we have to acknowledge that while we get some awesome operational value here, we get better blast radius, we get smaller deployments, we can deploy more frequently. Like, if you think about what it means to operate some of these environments that are highly decomposed environments, they still are harder. The distributed nature, the more distributed it is, the more microservices I have. In fact, these are the organizations I'm working with who are unwinding, is partly because they see too much operational complexity in what they built, and their DevOps teams and their other teams are working hard to keep up with what's going on. But also things like, just like, what's the resilience profile of this, right? Is this some part of my system that it never changes? It doesn't, even if it went down, it wouldn't bring the rest of the system down. And where are the bottlenecks of consumption in my environment? Where are the places where we know in the 80-20 rule that, like, our users are hammering this part of the system, and this is where scale and moving the scale needle is going to be super value, and there being smaller is probably going to be really valuable. What are the business pressures here? Like, how important is it for us to, like, get to a fully decomposed environment, or is it really just if we could go get really good microservices in these targeted areas of our system as a starting place where they're smaller and we get the goodness of the design, we could still leave parts of our system more coarse-grained here and get there a little bit faster. And we'll talk about, like, the path there a little bit. But release frequency also, like, how frequently are we releasing this? Is this part of our system that rarely changes? Because if it doesn't change very often, suddenly the value of deployment agility and a lot of the sort of blast radius and a lot of the other value propositions with having something be really small, you suddenly aren't getting much value out of them anyway because you hardly ever roll this service out. And I could go through this list. I will say team profile is one here that people will say, well, why would you put the profile of the team in here? Well, a whole lot of the value prop of microservices was, especially in these really big organizations, I have thousands of people, and we can carve up all these teams who have autonomy, who own these services. Like, autonomy was a huge part of the microservice story. And that means teams could say, hey, I've got a contract for my service, and that's how I bind to the rest of all these services that are going on, and now my team can move fast and operate on this. Well, what if I'm in an organization of 20 developers and I have 200 microservices? What's the ownership story in that model, and how do my teams align to autonomy? Or is it that every team, we have 200 services, but everybody in the team has to know all 200 services and how they work? Like, how is this going to land in the footprint of your team? Because because at some point we're going to have to not just build these things, we're going to have to support them and be able to dig into them. Now, being smaller will make them a little more approachable, but still, there's some overhead there, right? So for me, it's take all these factors and some more from the left-hand side. Absolutely, do your domain-driven design, do your event storming, do what other things help you tease out microservices, and then let what size comes out the other side of this be whatever the size is that is appropriate for your organization, right? And again, you're not going to get them right all the time, and you'll learn along the way. But what I want to allow for is, like, I can end up with this big purple service here at the top and not feel like I did something wrong, right? Because if everything has to look like the green boxes at the bottom, I'm going to ask why. Because some of these factors here absolutely are going to suggest different granularity. And then I guess for me, this is this notion of return on complexity that has become a bigger deal to me. I think that sometimes building for resilience, building for scale, like building for all these cool value propositions that are part of the cloud and part of microservices architecture are awesome, but what is the footprint of your organization? How many customers do you really have? What is this, not everybody's building Netflix. You're building for a resilience profile, and we're never gonna compromise on resilience, but there's one thing to build for the resilience of millions of users versus building for the resilience of hundreds of users or whatever the profile might be of your organization. So you have to think about where's the return on complexity in the environments, because the more and more we dig into these things, they have this really strong columns of things that they're awesome at, but they also have this column of complexity that they also bring to your organization. And you have to put complexity into that math. You ought to be doing some kind of ROI around complexity in this space to figure out how is this footprint of microservices that I come up with align with the broader value proposition, and are we really getting the value out of it, or are we just building a fully decomposed system because that's how it's supposed to go and we hope the value ends up being there? So for me, it's kind of about, if you take this value concept and you just say, let's pick a handful of criteria, right? How many customers do I really have, right? What's the real load profile of my customers? How do they consume my system? What are the ways they consume my system? What kind of throughput demands? Where are their throughput demands? It's almost always true that throughput is focused in some specific areas of your application where you know that, like, we have to do a really good job there. And if our architecture isn't really good, isn't really decomposed, and we haven't split the problem up, and we have to scale a ton there, and we have to scale efficiently there, we have to have the right services for that problem. What's the deployment frequency? I feel like this is one that gets lost in the shuffle a little bit, because sometimes we build parts of our system and we land these things in services and they're there, but like as features and functions are coming out, new capabilities are coming out, they just sit in the corner and they might sit there for a year and not change. Like versus something else that's in this high volatility area, new features coming, always changing based on the market. I want to look at that as a parameter here. And then what's the outage impact? And I feel weird even talking about outage impact because it sort of sounds like I'm saying, hey, it's okay to have an outage. No, we're not going to build anything where it's okay to have an outage. But there's a range of possibilities on outage, right? If I'm this massively scalable company with millions of customers and I have an outage and it's all over the newspaper tomorrow morning, that's different than a couple of my customers were upset because we were down for an hour yesterday. They're both bad, but there's a range of bad here. So how far do you rotate to resilience in a way that you're just wildly indexed on this because you think you need the most resilient system ever built? And so I do this little graph. I'm not sure it's an awesome graph, but I feel like I'm trying to just represent the idea of, if we look on the y-axis here, it's like, what's the profile? What are these inputs that I'm talking about into this equation? And then on the x-axis here, how do those correlate to return on complexity to me? And as soon as like scale and resilience and like all these other really hot button sort of things that are right in the sweet spot of having really small microservices come up, the return on the complexity ends up being much higher, those services, whereas if the environment and the workloads aren't so complex in certain parts of your system, or the nature of how it's consumed isn't so complex, and we still decompose that, the return on complexity isn't so awesome there. So I feel like you ought to be you ought to be modeling this somehow like this. I wish I had some awesome methodology to put around this. I don't, but I still feel like you've got to do something here to model this. And to me, this is about really finding the hotspots of value, right? Like I've said, I've kind of beat this to death already, but where are the bottlenecks? Like, that's the first thing I'm going to go after. Anytime I go into an organization that's moving to microservices, I'm like, where are those hotspots in your architecture? Where do you know that you aren't scaling very efficiently, or where are you wildly over provisioned because you're just worried about what's going to happen? And where is it that teams are struggling because every time something's broken, the dependencies between certain parts of the system are creating these challenges that are affecting performance or throughput or something of that nature. And these two could be related, but they could be separate. Also, where are business critical operations? Where are specific areas that have significance to if you look at this range of features and functions and capabilities in your solutions, some of those features and functions are like essential to your customers, essential to their business continuity. And then how do we align to teams? Like, I'm really gonna ask that question because I just don't think it gets, like, what's the right profile of microservices for our teams, and like what's the reality of day-to-day writing for this, maintaining for this? Can we have teams own these things? Can we not have teams? How do we distribute the microservices across different teams? So on. And then where might we be able to use decomposition to differentiate? Like, can we actually achieve some new throughput or achieve some new value proposition to our customers themselves because the decomposition of our services allow us to say something or achieve something with our system that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to achieve. And sometimes, by the way, that's release frequency, because it might just be, hey, we're always releasing super frequent features, are always coming in hot in this particular area of our system. And if we're pushing those features out really fast because we decomposed a ton, and we're getting feedback from our customers and we're able to release new capabilities at a faster pace, well, wow, that's an awesome value proposition that's going to drive loyalty from your customers, going to make them feel like they're getting more value to our system, and will lead to like product-led growth and some of these other things we try to drive in environments. Now, I mentioned this, but I really wanted to emphasize this point, which is, I think operational complexity somehow gets lost in this. I think and it's hard because the word operations is such a broad word here. If you talk about DevOps and just deployments and some of the other bits of a system, you could say, well, microservices could be argued to actually help in an operational respect, in that we have this really low friction process and teams can just go off and they can write their code and they can deploy and all those moving parts. Yes, it took a lot of work to build it, but it's working well. But you'll also see organizations where they'll say the number of repos we have and how many repos do we have and how are we managing versioning across that. And the more we get a bigger explosion of microservices, even in that space of DevOps, teams will start to say, wow, there's a lot of moving parts to this, and every time we're adding more services, it feels like it's getting a little heavier. You can contain that, and you might be able to get your arms around that and make that work. But the other side of operational complexity is, at some point, all these services are running. They're out there, they're in an environment, and I'm an operations person sitting at my console, and I'm trying to figure out some customer just called, or a handful of customers have called and said, like, this is broken or this isn't working. And it's my job now forensically to go figure out what's going on. Well, the more distributed my system is, the more, if I'm suddenly in a trace of 5 calls between 5 different microservices and somewhere in that chain it broke, but all I have is a log file and I'm trying to figure out where. Now, there are great tools here. There are great offerings from all the different sort of operational tool vendors that are out there that try to help you with this. But still, you have to acknowledge that this can add complexity to this. So even as you're thinking about how many microservices we're going to have and how we size our environment, you should be thinking a little bit about where's this aligned to the sort of operational readiness of your organization to support something of this model. Okay, so that's a lot of the sort of underlying sort of principles behind sizing to me, and how and why I think you ought to think differently about sizing. But then, what can I tell you to do practically to go away and actually think about how you might do this? And I will confess, I think this is very much a work in progress. I think I would love and will continue to probably iterate on this and try to find a way to make this more refined and give more terminology and more taxonomy to these strategies. But I still think there's plenty we can say here. And the one I most feel like is the most compelling to me, at least, is this idea of creating a value map. Like, if I'm going to go away, I've done my domain-driven design, I've done some kind of event storming maybe, but I have some sense of candidate services that might be in my environment. Now can I go create this value map? And I just happen to use a quadrant for this because I kind of like the way quadrants align things and give me some sort of visual representation of where things are landing. And I created a couple of axes for this. These are not meant to be the de facto axes. You might put different things on the axes here, but I wanted to capture some extremes. So on the y-axis at the top is that, hey, this is where we have the most business critical operations. This is where we've got high throughput. This is where we need efficient, rapid scaling, right? The system has to be able to react and respond quickly. This is where, like, right in the sweet spot of a really small microservices kind of space, because that we want to really just take full advantage of all the goodness of efficient scale and localized resilience and all these other things that we want, and a really good microservices architecture. And so we have the opposite on the other end of that scale, right? We have things that are down here that they're not consumed super heavily. They have a modest scaling profile. There's nothing about them that needs them to suddenly scale out and add massive workload. And the throughput and the consumption overall is just not that big of a deal for these services. SLAs aren't a big deal here, so on. On the x-axis, I've also put more about how quickly things change and how frequently we need to deploy them. Because I feel like that's a big part of this as well. Because to me, when I have small services and I have rapid deployment, like that's a really good sweet spot of sizing. I get tons of benefit out of a microservice when it's tiny, and I know deploying it's not going to have a big impact on the rest of the system, and I have smaller testing I have to do for it. It's the fact that it's changing a lot though, and it's the fact that I have to deploy it a lot that means I'm going to extract value from it. And so then we put on the other end of that spectrum sort of the opposite of this, which is it's infrequently deployed, it has slow evolution. And I also say the autonomy value here, you'll notice I call that out. I think when things are really small and I could get more value and they're really focused on solving a clear business problem, I would love to have teams have more autonomy around making sure that service is healthy and well built and well tested and so on. Like I could probably have more things on the left-hand side be shared by teams and have more people involved in it, because it's just not going to get nearly as much benefit out of owning it because somebody might not touch it that frequently. I could even rotate different people in to work on it. So then what I have to do is say, okay, I've got my candidate services, where do they land in the quadrant, right? And I've just fictitiously thrown some in here to say, hey, these services in the top right quadrant, especially the things to the far right side and the top, are probably really good candidates are going to be really good candidates for sizing. And by the way, when these land here, they might be a coarse grain size here that like lands at something that could then be further decomposed because it's on the right-hand side, and we know we're going to get a ton of value out of it. We release it frequently, and it's a big part of being at the epicenter of the workloads in my environment. Meanwhile, the things in the bottom left corner, I don't deploy them that often. They don't have a lot of usage. They don't have a lot of consumption. Obviously, I'm going to say down here, like, am I going to get a lot of value out of making, tens or hundreds of services out of the things that are going down in this bottom left corner? Probably not as much. And there's subjective things you could argue there. But then, and then there's those sort of outliers that might be, hey, got high volume, but we don't release. They're a critical part of the system, but we hardly ever change it. Or we have rapid evolution, but it isn't a frequently released service, things of that nature. This is not perfect, but I think it gives you a better sense of where I'm going here, which is, you'll notice I think, in fact, some people would say you're sort of defeating the microservices mindset, which is because this is all about domains and contexts and boundaries. And I feel like these criteria are super critical to me to deciding how and where I'm going to put my microservices. And I make choices about microservices even based on just the consumption of that service that has nothing to do with its domain role. It might be more about an operational role or a throughput role or a scale role. And I want to put that context into our thought process. Now, I just have some sort of basic ones that I think probably are ones you'd already think here, but certainly one of the big areas as I think about candidates for smaller microservices is this idea of scale efficiency. And what I'm getting at here is when I look at some service and some service has high consumption, and I know that I need it to scale potentially horizontally effectively, but I also need it to scale down effectively because I'm still trying to get good consumption out of that. I want to look at the decomposition of my services to ask, like, what's going to force this thing to scale? So if you look on the left-hand side here, you'll look at this service, it's got all these operations in it, but one of the operations in it happens to just get hammered, and that one piece of the service gets hammered a ton. But now the only way to get more sort of scale out of that service is just to add more units of scale to that service, even though parts of the service are barely being consumed at all. But to make that one dimension of the service scale, I just have to scale wildly, and I may not end up scaling very efficiently. I may be just having to add services to add that new capability. So that begs the question: is there a way to pull that apart, and can I make just the part of it that's being consumed heavily scale independently? Sometimes you can do that. Data is always in the story. Data is always a hard part of microservices. So you can't just arbitrarily say, well, that part of the system's there. But what's the secret under all of this is always there's data. We have coupling to data. We've encapsulated data by the microservice. So you still have to balance all of that in this story. But then on the right-hand side of also, like, we just have things that have really spiky loads. Parts of the day they're barely consumed, but when they get hit hard, they need to scale fast. But I don't want to over-provision. I want to be able to say, well, the granularity of my service is such that and of course tech gets into this too, my containers and my serverless, like there's lots of other variables here. But in general, is the decomposition going to scale efficiently for these high value areas? The key is I'm not applying this to all my services. I'm using it to figure out which services have these profiles and ask, how does this affect their decomposition? How does this affect their size? The other one that gets lost in this a little bit is storage scaling here. So if I have this order microservice and it's a kind of a chunky service, and it's running on some storage compute, I'm running on RDS or whatever I'm running on, and I've sized the instance on RDS to say, how big is this environment? How big is the compute going to be here? And then on the other side of this, I've decided in this coarse grain model, I've got all this different types of data that's all in this one order service that's underneath the hood of all this. And I have to figure out, are there noisy neighbor conditions for some parts of this data? I have to think about the scale of the storage underneath all of this, I guess is my point. So part of the sizing story and arriving at the right sizing story for your microservice is, how does the underlying services that you depend on scale effectively as well, and where is smaller going to be better for you there? Could I, for example, carve out fulfillment because it's loosely coupled, and I could carve it out on its own, and fulfillment ends up being this massively scalable part of our storage story, and I can't get good alignment on the sizing of my RDS instance to figure out how to do it. Let me break that out, put fulfillment in its own microservice, and then find the right story for sizing the storage compute for that service. So I think there's tons to think about there. It's the part we don't think about enough when we think about microservices. We tend to only think about the compute of the actual application service more, and we sort of just drag the storage along with us. You can't. Like, a lot of times the thing that most will drive this is from the bottom up of this, which is what's the profile of the storage, what's the profile of the compute of the storage, and what's its influence there. This one's like the sort of the no-brainer version of, like, should you be thinking about? You should be thinking about sizing and fault tolerance always across all of these. This is the one, this bulkhead model where we talk about the ship, and the ship has a set of bulkheads, and if something hits the ship and puts a hole in the bulkhead, only that bulkhead fills up with water, but it doesn't bring the entire boat down. We want to apply that same model to everything we think about with microservices, in that we want to pick a granularity and a size that says if this one service goes down, we can maybe have fallbacks, we can implement other techniques to prevent the entire system come down. Well, these things are all truths for all services, but some services need much more careful handling here, and they think much more about how they're at the epicenter of hundreds of interactions in your system potentially. They're clearly like a fault tolerance hub. Like, so how do I size that part of my system correctly so that I have a really good fault tolerance story? Other parts of my system, their fault tolerance story isn't so complicated. It's not so hard. They're used in these contexts. I could fall back if they failed. No end user would even see the outage, it wouldn't be a big deal. So it's still relative. We don't want to just say fault tolerance is the same story for all services. It's just not true. There are clearly services that have a profile and a size that's specific to achieving their fault tolerance goals. Then the obvious one here is just performance bottlenecks, right? I've sort of hit this bottleneck, but if I have this big service, I know this service just is SLA, just not running enough bits. Is this an opportunity to just decompose this into different microservices? And of course, this is just classic evolution of a microservice here, but we also have to acknowledge that some of this stuff gets sized along the way, right? So here we look at the performance of these environments, and we realize, hey, product and search, that like we're just getting tons of problems here with SLAs and scale and all these other problems, and it looks like we can pull search apart from that without creating a bit of a problem. And obviously we're going to look at the chattiness that we've created by pulling it apart, because if we've created that problem, then we just created a little bit of a noisy neighbor issue for ourselves. But this is certainly something that drives your sizing story. To me, ultimately, this is about drawing a value line. If you say, I'm not going to go do all this data, I'm not going to go ask myself all these questions. For me, it's like if I want to draw a line in the sand a little bit and say, okay, on one side of this equation, I know there are these coarse-grained services, more coarse-grained. And what is coarse-grained? And people will begin to ask me, well, what do you mean by coarse-grained? There's no absolutes to coarse-grained. My point is, like, you don't have to go to the smallest possible service, but coarse-grained might just be the aggregate of a few things. And then what's on the right-hand side of the line here? Where are the services that are truly going to extract the most value based on being sized perfectly and deploy and achieve the deployment, achieve the agility, and so on? And ask yourself which things can live on the left and which things we know have to be on the right now. So I might, and this is just me putting some things together, I might say, I can put the product in the catalog and the rating service sort of concepts over here. Those could be separate services, but I don't get much value out of them because they fall in the right place in my value quadrant. Same with users and roles, like they're there, but they're not really being consumed in a way that rapidly changes in the system. And then often configuration, metadata, these all things that are used to sort of set up and configure systems. They're there, but once they're there, they rarely change, and I'm just gonna put them together because it makes sense. And then on the right-hand side, I'm gonna come back to these talks we already talked about, where cart and payment, I'm in an e-commerce system, and if the transactions of my system can't go through because the cart's not working or some other part of the system, I have to be able to do everything I can to maximize resilience, maximize scale, all those other goods here. And then I've just got other examples here, right? High throughput and rapid scale. Search, I might have a high throughput sort of profile to it. Taxation might be released all the time because the tax policies are changing and we're always having to update the tax policy, so I get value out of that one because we're deploying it so frequently. And for me, if you could just land things on one side of the line or the other here as a starting point, then you can start asking yourself over time, are these right, and how does this need to evolve, and so on. So to me, I don't know if you're familiar with the notion of design smells and what are the indicators of this. I feel like that same sort of model could apply here as well, right? We could ask ourselves, after we've come up with this and we've decided where we started, what kind of questions can we be asking ourselves? Is it really consuming efficiently? How is the size of it affecting developer productivity? There's a whole range of questions we could ask ourselves to say, is leaving this service big really good, or did we just leave it big because we just don't feel like pulling it apart and it's a lot of work to pull it apart and it's mostly not hurting us? You have to figure out whether there might be something in that big service that really does meet the bar for high throughput or something else, and do you need to tease it out? And the same thing goes for, is the service too small? This is the one I think people don't realize we can also go the other direction, which is are we really seeing the full value proposition of having made this thing really small? Or is it just small because we decided it was small at the beginning, so we left it small? Well, you can also go the other direction and take 2 or 3 services and say, across the usage patterns, the data we have says these things aren't getting much value out of this. Developers are still having trouble working with them more separated. Let's put them back together and make a service, a more coarse-grained service out of them. So ultimately, to me, I think all the literature out here on microservices would say, and although I don't know that everybody follows this, is no matter how you want to arrive at what your microservices are, you should always look at this as an evolutionary model, right? You should never go away. The worst case scenario is one where you're like, we're going to microservices, we went away, we did domain-driven design, and we did event storming. We've identified 200 microservices, and we're writing all 200 microservices as the first version of our system. And I think most people know already not to do that, but I feel like as attaching the appropriate disclaimer, no matter how you get there, even if you choose to use a different approach and your goal is eventually to have 200 microservices, don't start there. Because there's too much to learn in here, right? There's too much to extract from a running, living system. Too much operational knowledge, too much developer knowledge, too much scale knowledge that is not available to you if you just go away in the dark and come back and just start writing services, right? So for me, it's like just expect no matter what principles you have, there's no perfect path to right sizing. Yes, go do domain-driven design like I said, but please, what I would say is when you go do this, go add these contextual bits to your discussion. And if it's not the contextual bits I'm suggesting in here, go find your own contextual bits, but ask the questions. Ask yourself how or if these is the right boundaries for my service and so on. And learn from working services, right? Like there's nothing better to shape your design than insights about real-time insights from how those environments are built and how they're running and how they're working. And because to me, there's nothing better than sitting in a room and we're talking about the decomposition of our services and we have like raw data from like, oh, here's how frequently it's being called. Here's what teams are deploying. Whenever they deploy this, it seems to have the dependency on this and this, and it's too painful to deploy. Like that real feedback from your system is the thing that's going to give you a much stronger sense of, oh, this has to be pulled apart, or this has to be recomposed into something bigger. Like that's where this stuff all really shines to me, which is we aren't just trying to go to that shiny object version of that at the end that is just like we just want this web of hundreds of microservices. We want to go to that version where we know the most value is being achieved by our business based on the decomposition that was right for our particular business. And I feel very strongly about that being the outcome and not just a count of services that you happen to end up with, or that you just based on some nouns, you've just decided this is where I'm going to divide these. So how you get there matters. I've already sort of shared this idea, right? So I want you to start with a bunch of coarse-grained services. You can have some small services here. Capture the activity. Identify a few microservice candidates in here. Start breaking some things apart. Go iterate a little more, and arrive at another set of microservices and just view this as a living, evolving entity, right? And view this as something that is never done, which we all know is never done anyway, but view your microservice decomposition as something that's never done. But the key piece of this is what activity, what data do I have here to tell me how or if this is my microservices architecture is really living up to its design, right? Now, one of the things that's really powerful here is for organizations, because most organizations are often in a state of modernization of some kind. They have an existing legacy solution, and they're trying to move into a microservice-based architecture. And for me, this is where this evolutionary kind of model really shines, right? Because we definitely, in a modernization story, don't want to go away and just, here's all the microservices and release one, it's all fully decomposed. So this same thing, I've got my legacy monolith, we use this strangler pattern. We see a lot of people talk about how to tease out a first set of services, and part of my system is running in these smaller services, and the rest of my system is running in this monolith, and then I just keep iterating. But the key question here is, what's the fully modernized end state? Well, it isn't that every one of those boxes that started in my legacy monolith have been broken down and are all small and they're all tiny microservices now. I don't know. I might do 2 or 3 iterations. I might end up with like 10 or 15 microservices, and I might leave a lot of the other stuff into these bigger coarse-grained services because that's what made sense for my business. And that makes a much better modernization story for business. It also usually means time to market and time to value for the business is shorter, and you have a better window of opportunity there to seize the day. So I said data's critical here. Like a lot of the data is available, but I guess my point is, I want you to go out of your way to really build performance profiles of your microservices. Like some of the data is already there and a lot of the tools that are out there, but I want you to make a conscious choice about what kind of insights do I need about how my microservices are being consumed to successfully evaluate whether that microservice is achieving the goals I have for it. Is the sizing really working for it? So here, we can instrument it in this example. This is a serverless stack, a serverless application stack. I can get data at the gateway level. I can get data at the entry point to my REST microservices about how the individual microservices are being consumed. And I can even go down to how are the underlying services inside those services, microservices getting consumed, and then use data from CloudWatch and ask myself just interesting questions about the data. How, again, it's more about working backwards from what kind of data is going to give me meaningful insight into whether or not my sizing is right. I think sometimes we work backwards from the metrics we already have, like what's the CPU consumption, what's the memory consumption, do we have the right instance size? That's all really good stuff, and there's really good infrastructure to questions. That's a little bit different than, is the decomposition right? Is the sizing right? And rarely in those tools is there something that says, is it too small and we're not getting enough value out of it? You have to find out how and where to get that data to ask the is it too small question. Also, it's gonna ask the is it too big question. And so for me, this stuff ought to get woven into your operational experience, right? I feel like this isn't just something the architects do off on the side and they're kind of just looking at the data and trying to ask themselves, how is my sizing working? The operation teams should have a vested interest in the sizing as well. They should care about whether or not, like they are experiencing issues, they're seeing challenges, they're seeing scale issues, and the microservices are often at the center of that problem, and the decomposition is creating bottlenecks or it's creating scaling problems. I want that to surface in a way that the operations teams are thinking about. They're not going to drive the decomposition story, but they can still have data that will tell you there's a challenge here. So just a few takeaways here. Don't chase the shiny object, right? Don't try to be the 200 or the 500 or the company that just says we are proud of our architecture because of how many microservices have. Go after the value, right? And just know, there are no absolutes to this right sizing story. There is no way I can tell you, here's a formula, here's the things that should be small, here's the things that big, here's how big they should be, here's how small they are. This all has to be driven by context. And to me, I always prefer to start coarse grain, and I love this notion of saying let things earn their way out, right? Let something, I would much rather be compelled by the activity of my system telling me I really need this microservice to be 3 microservices because the data tells me so, right? And then I think don't assume smaller is better here is always an important piece of this, and I think I beat that one to death. But also, I want you to put complexity in this story. It's not just about frequency of calls and the scaling profile and the architectural dimensions of this. It's about the complexity for your entire organization. Is the microservice decomposition achieving what we want as a product and as an architecture, but is it also adding complexity to areas of our business, and because of the number of services we're creating, we're making it harder for operations teams to troubleshoot, or the DevOps story is more challenging than we expected, and the value isn't being returned that we expect. And like I said, absolutely get the insights and the data that you need, and then expect this to evolve all the time. Expect this to be a living thing. And then finally, just the broader overarching theme I have for all this, sizing for microservices just needs a broader context. Take the core principles that are foundational to microservices, continue to live by those, and then just add your context of your environment and your teams and your domain, and arrive at what the right story is here. And that's it. I hope this gave you all just a new mental model for how to think about sizing, or maybe some of you are there. I will also say lots of people talking about right sizing. I'm not inventing this concept. I just think this is a natural sort of next step in thinking about how we build microservice-based architecture. So for that, hope you enjoy the rest of your reInvent, and thanks so much. Have a good day.